We'll take a look at Governor Pat Quinn's State of the State address next on Capitol View. Good evening, and thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois politics and government. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues Magazine, and with me today is Charile Wheeler, Director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at UIS. Charlie, always glad to have you here.
Thank you.
And Patrick Yeagle, a reporter with Illinois Times. Pat, good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So Governor Pat Quinn gave his State of the State address this week. This is a speech where he kind of sets the tone for how he views Illinois and what he would like to do moving forward in the new legislative session. Charlie, can you kind of just touch on your overall impressions of the speech?
I thought first in terms of the delivery, I thought it was a very well-delivered speech, particularly for Pat Quinn. He obviously used the teleprompter. There wasn't a lot of wandering around. He stuck to the script. It was very well organized and well written. And it, in essence, did what a State of the State speech is supposed to be, is basically an infomercial for the governor and for his administration. He talked about some of the accomplishments that he saw as having occurred under his tenure. He talked about some of the difficulties we had, and in that sense it was pretty much the same as State of the States that we've had from other governors going back, well, in my personal experience, all the way to Dick Ogilvy. And I guess I'm kind of befuddled why Quinn was attacked. Well, not from the Republicans, because that's their job to be against the governor and say nasty things about him. I mean, when Jim Thompson was governor, when Jim Yeagle was governor, Democrats said nasty things about their states of the state. It's kind of part of the game. But the media suggesting that, well, he didn't put out specifics and he didn't lay out specific plans. And I'm thinking to myself, well, that's not what this is about. That comes in a month when he delivers the budget address. That's when the hard stuff comes, the nitty gritty. This is kind of the visionary cloud in the sky type thing. And that's what governors have been doing as long as I've been watching this. And I think he did it, and he delivered it, as I say, fairly well.
Pat, you were over at the State House to check out the speech. What was your takeaway?
I have to go with Charlie. I think he did a very good job of sticking to the script. In the past, he has kind of wandered a little bit and talked about everything from soybeans to his father. And you know, some stuff belongs in a State of the State, some stuff doesn't. And he did a really good job of staying on message. And actually, he did a really good job of outlining a lot of victories that have happened under his rule, especially cuts that have been made. I know that's one of the things that Republicans love to hammer on. You know, this governor hasn't made enough cuts, he hasn't made enough cuts, but he actually has made cuts, and they've been very painful ones that a lot of his own constituency does not like. But he did a very good job of outlining those, so it's going to be difficult for opponents to come along later and say, well, you know, you didn't cut enough. So,
yeah, and again, from having watched this for a long time, it occurs to me, and this maybe sounds cynical, that wasteful spending is something that's in your district but not in mine. And a worthwhile program is something in my district that in your district would be a waste of money. And there's a lot of provincialism. For example, Quinn mentioned how he shut down a lot of state facilities to save money that then could be allocated to other purposes. And there were complaints earlier in the week when the House was passing legislation to re-spend some of the money that was saved by closures, particularly prison closures, that in essence this was blood money because of the problems in the prison system caused by closing TAMs. Well, you really can't have it both ways. I mean, if you want to save money, you have to cut somewhere, and unfortunately, as I've said many, many times, there's not some guy in the basement of the State House shoveling $100 bills into a furnace that you can say, okay, that's all, stop. I mean, the stuff all goes for purposes for which there is some level of support among the citizens, the diverse citizenry of this large state.
But you saw some of that dissension even among Democrats. I talked to Representative Brandon Phelps, who's a downstate Democrat. You know, the theme of the speech was, this is our Illinois. And he said, well, it's not my Illinois because they close facilities in my area. So you did see some of that polarization by region. And, you know, as long as we're talking about that, let's go ahead and talk about the gun control issue, because that's one of those issues that really brings out that polarization. Illinois is likely going to see a concealed carry bill this year. A federal court ruled that the state needs to open up to carry. Attorney General Lisa Madigan has contested that ruling, but right now we're looking at a timeline that was 180 days from December. So this is something the lawmakers are really looking to kind of jump on working on. Governor Quinn made it kind of clear that he would like to see a more limited bill. Charlie, what are your thoughts on his comments on guns and specifically on carry?
Well, I think his comments are in keeping with his position all along. And as you said, the federal court has said that Illinois has to allow concealed carry. And so the gun control folks are kind of on the spot, because if nothing happens, then all regulation is off the books and the gun folks can do whatever they want. And their problem is for example, what Quinn was asking for, a ban on so-called assault weapons, that's not going to happen. No way. And the notion that it should be very limited and that probably the only place you can actually carry a gun outside your home is on the sidewalk, but you can't take it into a theater, you can't take it into a restaurant, you can't take it into a school, a church, a tavern, anywhere else. That's probably not going to fly anyway. And I think of all the things that he put forward that he's supporting, the thing he's least likely to get is the kind of gun control that he's looking for.
I think a lot of people would agree with you, Charlie, that the assault weapons ban is not going to happen on the state level in Illinois. But can you elaborate a little bit as to why that is pretty dead in the water here at the beginning of session?
Well, I think it goes to what we were talking about earlier, the fact that Illinois is a very diverse state, and in different parts of the state, firearms mean something else. If you live in a rural area, you think of a firearm and you probably think of going deer hunting or duck hunting.
Sure.
I had a nephew who worked for a downstate school district for a while, and the first day of deer season was a holiday, and he's from the suburbs. And so he said to the principal, well, is that because the students won't show up? He said, no, it's the teachers won't show up either, because it's a holiday. Everybody goes deer hunting. In the Chicago area, particularly in portions of the city, guns in people's minds equate to little kids getting caught in crossfire and killed, like the tragedy that happened just last week. And so you have this differing viewpoint, and it makes it very hard for people to find common ground. And it's probably the most divisive issue in the state of Illinois on a regional basis. And even within the city of Chicago, I've seen accounts where folks who live in poor neighborhoods, minority neighborhoods, are more supportive of guns because they fear violence on the street. People who live in well-to-do neighborhoods don't really want guns because they're fearful of somebody coming up to them with a gun. So it's really a difficult issue to get everybody on the same page, and I don't think it's going to happen.
Well, there is a group of folks in the legislature that's hoping to get everyone on the same page, and it's going to be led by what it looks like Brandon Phelps, who I mentioned earlier, and Chicago Senator Kwame Raoul. Pat, you're familiar with Senator Raoul. What kind of approach do you think he will bring to this?
I think he's definitely one of the types that likes to negotiate and find a consensus before he moves forward. But at the same time, he also a lot of times knows what he wants, and he's not afraid to say so and say, you know, I hear what you're saying, but I disagree, and we're going to go forward with my way because this is why. And so I think he'll probably be pretty even-handed in getting people involved and you know, actually listening to people. But to put things in perspective, I think that the concealed carry folks carry most of the cards right now. They have the federal decree, and that basically is a trump card. The only card they don't hold is a legislative majority that is, you know, necessarily sympathetic. Of course, we've talked about the regional differences, and so if it comes down to it, I think a lot of Democrats will probably end up voting against, you know, a basically vote for more control if they have to make a choice between party and their, I guess, their constituency, because with, you know, ever-present issue of crime, I've had a couple of people tell me point blank, nobody ever lost an election by being tough on crime. So I think that's always going to be a trump card. But for right now, the folks who want concealed carry, they have that trump card of the federal decree, and so until I think it's early June is when that 180 days runs out. Until that happens, I think they they're just really if they sit back and just wait and try and fight off the issue of home rule preemption. Actually, they want the home rule preemption so that cities like Chicago can't opt out. As long as they can hold off on that, they are almost, I'm not going to say guaranteed a victory, but they're guaranteed some measure of victory.
Well, and it seems like there are definitely some Chicago lawmakers, Charlie, who maybe are still hoping for a possibility of keeping Chicago out. But realistically speaking, I mean, the people who will be in charge of this realize that that's probably not going to happen, right?
Yeah, and I think the to pick up on the point that Pat made, the only leverage to get some kind of restriction that the gun control folks have is to hold out a promise that, well, we will support legislation with a sufficient constitutional majority in the chamber, in other words, 3/5, that we can take away the ability of home rule units to set their own parameters. And so there'll be a statewide concealed carry law for everyone. The city of Chicago won't be able to enact something more strict. And we offer that to you if you will go along with putting what we consider reasonable restrictions into concealed carry in the first place, in terms of training, in terms of where you can carry a weapon, those kinds of things. And so that's, as Pat was saying, that's the only card they have, is to be willing to give up the preemption, because the concealed carry folks are going to win, assuming that the appellate court doesn't reverse itself. And the Supreme Court has already ruled on this. And so they ultimately will win. The trade-off for them would be, if we just say, nope, we're not going to be for anything, let the laws all fall, then Chicago will enact tougher regulation, and we'll be back in court, and it'll be another couple of years before the thing finally gets resolved at a cost of great expense. So the question is, do we go for less than absolute victory now and have the issue resolved, or do we hold out and spend a lot of more time and energy to get absolute victory somewhere down the road?
Well, and House Speaker Michael Madigan announced today that there are going to be some House hearings on the issue later this month. Charlie, what did we take from that announcement?
I suspect that the hearings are going to be, this probably sounds cynical too, it's to provide backup for whatever the ultimate decision is, because if the hearings are open to everyone, and if they're run on a legitimate basis, you're going to hear the same arguments that we've been hearing for decades on this issue, and they're going to be brought forward by constituents. And so at the end of the day, the people who make the decisions will be able to say, oh, so-and-so in Rockford wanted this, so-and-so in Carbondale thought this was a good idea, so-and-so in Ravenswood wanted this included, and they'll be able to have some backup for whatever they decide on. Because I don't really think that having hearings is going to bring out any new information that any lawmaker doesn't already know, unless the lawmaker has been in a coma for the last several years.
I mean, the main difference is that maybe not perceptions have changed, but perceptions of the situation have changed. A lot of the gun control folks are saying, hey, we know this is happening, so maybe we need to look at being open to things we weren't open to before. One of
the, I think, important notes about this is that even though Republicans mostly want this to, want concealed carry to happen, the issue is probably more divisive for Democrats than it is for Republicans, because the Democrats, downstate Democrats, sometimes some of them are in favor of concealed carry. So it's more divisive for Democrats than Republicans. So if Republicans keep milking this, they have an easy election issue right there against Democrats as a party, instead of necessarily this Democrat or that Democrat.
Another topic that Quinn touched on in his speech that's also sort of determined by region as far as lawmakers view it was same-sex marriage. A bill to legalize same-sex marriage has passed in a Senate committee. That's happened one time previously. It happened during lame duck session, but they weren't able to get it for a floor vote. But Senate President John Cullerton has called for the passage of this bill on Valentine's Day, which is either sweet or a little shticky, depending on how you feel about it. But Charlie, you wrote a column for Illinois Issues recently on this topic. Can you talk to us a little bit about the changing perceptions that we're seeing here?
Yeah, I think this is an issue that will happen. Unlike concealed carry and well, concealed carry will happen, but
This one really will happen.
this one will really happen. Well, concealed carry really well too, but I was thinking more in terms of the gun control aspect, the ban on any particular kind of weaponry. That's not going to happen. The governor may want it, but it's not going to happen. The governor wants same-sex marriage, that will happen. And I think it's because people's attitudes have changed. And it's been a long progression, and I think part of it is that people are realizing one's sexual orientation is not something that one wakes up in the morning and says, oh, I think I'm going to be gay today. That it is hardwired into people. It's part of their makeup. It's who they are. And as people realize this, and as more and more people, straight folks, realize, hey, that friend of mine, that person is gay, or she's gay, and they're normal people. And they start to realize that people of different sexual orientation are just the same as anyone else. They have the same hopes, the same aspirations, they want to be treated the same. And that's changed the thinking in the body politic. It took forever to get the state of Illinois to agree that discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation was wrong. And that finally happened in the early 2000s. Then it took another 8 or 10 years before we recognized civil unions. And now we're on the verge of recognizing same-sex marriage. There will be opposition, or there is opposition from people who feel deeply within their hearts that religiously this violates my concept of what the Lord's plan for the world is. And I think there will be an accommodation reached so that people of faith can keep their faith and not be forced, for example, to participate in a same-sex marriage. But on the other hand, I think in our pluralistic society, one person's set of beliefs can't be used to discriminate against someone else, because not everybody shares the same views on religion, theology. There's a certain number of people don't believe in any of the spiritual stuff at all. So,
well, Charile, I think you lay it out really well. But Pat, why have we seen some political resistance to this then? I mean, Charile makes some really good points as to why maybe this should be done, but it didn't have the votes in lame duck session. It does seem to have momentum now, but why do we see some resistance?
I think historically, of course, as Charile laid out, it has been a religious issue, and a lot of folks tended to see the government's enforcement of marriage as an extension of not necessarily a church-run state, but a state that was, founded on principles that are common with the church. And so a lot of folks saw that as, the state may not be the church, they may not be synonymous, but they are closely related. And so I think that perception is starting to change a little bit, in that people are beginning to see this issue not so much as a religious issue versus religious versus secular, but more as a civil rights issue. And a lot of folks are beginning to recognize that there is a very, without making a judgment myself on the appropriateness of the case, it's a very difficult case to defend that this is not a civil rights issue. And so a lot of folks are starting to understand that, and so some of the historical resistance is starting to change from, this is against my own personal beliefs, and so therefore the government should not do it, into this is against my personal beliefs, but I understand that these folks have a civil rights argument, and so maybe I need to hold my beliefs here and let them hold their civil rights issues here. So I think starting to compartmentalize the two.
Well, Governor Pat Quinn also touched on what is maybe considered one of the biggest issues before the legislature right now, and that is pension reform. We talk about it, it seems like, every week on the show, and we will continue to. Charile, what do you think about what Quinn had to say on pension reform? He did come out in favor of John Cullerton's plan, SB 1. He's done this before, but this was the most adamant public backing of that bill. Yeah,
and he's been pushing for something to happen for, almost as long as he's been governor. And he's said in the past this is his mission on earth, is to get this accomplished. And he was very forceful in supporting Senate Bill 1. Now that's a bill that has two plans. The first plan is one that would reduce benefits for people who are in the pension system now, require them to pay more, and has some other things that are intended to lower costs on down the road. There's a pretty strong argument to be made constitutionally, however, and it's one I'll admit I'll share, and I suppose I have a conflict of interest in that were I ever to decide to retire, I'd probably qualify for a state university retirement system pension. But the argument is that the Constitution says membership in a pension system, a public pension system in Illinois, is a contractual relationship, and its benefits can't be diminished or impaired. And so for the legislature to come in and say, okay, we're changing the terms of your contract unilaterally, I don't think that'll pass constitutional muster.
And neither does
That's
President John Cullerson.
Right, so that's plan A. Plan B is, okay, and this is, I guess I'm paraphrasing John Cullerton, okay, go ahead, pass plan A. When the Supreme Court says, no, this ain't gonna fly, here's plan B. Plan B gives members of a pension system a choice. You can continue to get your same cost of living adjustment compounded year after year, but you'll have to forego state subsidy for health insurance. Or you can agree to less of a cost of living, calculated in a different way that'll save us a lot of money, but we will help you with your health insurance. And because we are not forcing you, we're giving you a choice, this gets around the unilateral changing of the contract difficulty. Now, there's some people who would argue, well, it's not really a choice. That's like the guy comes up and puts the gun in your ribs and says, you can give me your wallet or I pull the trigger. What kind of a choice is that? But it's probably more constitutional than the idea of just coming in and changing the benefits. And so that's basically the plan that is in play. It's the one that Quinn has signed on to, and he defended it very forcefully. And there was some criticism of Quinn, well, you haven't provided specifics of what you're for. Well, go read the bill. The bill is, I forget how many pages, it's well over 100 pages long, and it's pretty darn specific about what its provisions are.
Just when you thought pension reform couldn't become more complicated, it's now like plan A and then plan B. And I've always grown a little when I have to describe this in a story. But Pat, some of the folks in the House are saying, the savings can't really be calculated from this plan when you give people a choice. And is that fair to ask lawmakers to vote on something where they don't really know what they would be saving? What are the drawbacks there?
That's a really tough question because, as you mentioned, without knowing exactly what we're going to save, it's really tough to project, especially because we don't know how many of the boomer generation are going to start retiring, now versus another 5 years, or it depends a lot on how things work out in the minutia. The devil's in the details, basically, and asking somebody to vote on something that. But the outcomes and the results of those plans are still up in the air. I mean, what actually happens once you enact those specifics is unclear, and so I think we're going to see a lot of recalcitrance from people who just are not sure which way to go. And one thing to notice, or one thing that's important to note, I think, is that the unions largely have not been allowed at the negotiating table, and they've been clamoring for a summit. Let's have a summit and let's talk about this together. If they, as Charlie said, the term unilateral definitely applies here because they have, for the most part, not been consulted in this this latest round of debates. And so anything that passes, even if it sounds reasonable, is probably going to get challenged in court, and that's unless the legislature recognizes that and lets at least some of the unions in, something is going. It's going to go to the courts, and then who knows what's going to happen. So.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that should be noted too is that AFSCME, American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, the largest public employee union in the state, representing workers in a whole bunch of different state agencies and in other government operations, is like the lead spokesperson on all of this stuff for organized labor in the public sector. But on the other hand, AFSCME doesn't represent anybody. I'm a public employee. I work for the University of Illinois Springfield. I'm not in AFSCME. I'm not in any union. I take that back. I'm a lifetime member of the Chicago Newspaper Guild and proud of it. But that's a private entity. It has nothing to do with my state employment. And the same is true, for example, for public school teachers. The vast majority of people in the teachers' retirement system are represented either by the Illinois Education Association or the Illinois Federation of Teachers. Very few are members of AFSCME. So how do you get everybody on board? And even if I'm in a union, can the union bargain away my contractual rights? What if I don't want to give that up? Would I have standing to go into court and say, well, you know, my union is in favor of this, but I disagree with my union, and the Constitution gives me a contractual right in my pension benefits?
Well, one of the other complaints that folks that have worked on the House plan have about this this two-tiered plan is that if you throw two different ideas at the Supreme Court, it might muddle the issue, it might muddle the argument. The Supreme Court might not really get a clear message of the vastness of the problem and what needs to be done to address it. Pat, you covered court speeds for a while. What are your thoughts on this argument?
I don't think that holds a lot of water. We have some pretty smart judges in Illinois, and they know the issue.
You think they can walk and chew gum at the same time?
I think they can handle it. I mean, not only are they smart people, but everybody and their brother knows that we have a pension problem, and everybody and their brother, they may not know exactly what the cause is, but I guarantee you those judges know what the cause is and what the outcomes are and what the eventual results will be one way or the other. I don't think that argument, that the courts are not going to be able to handle this, this complex issue. I think they're going to be able to handle it pretty well.
Yeah.
Charlie, we've got just about a minute left. Governor Pat Quinn also pitched open primaries. That's something he brings up a lot. What do you think on that?
I personally think it's a good idea to allow voters to go into the primary voting booth, or voting table, I guess, nowadays, and choose whether they want to vote in the Republican primary or in the Democratic primary, which is kind of a limited open primary. There are other states where it's totally wide open, where you go in and you can vote, okay, I'm going to vote among the Democrats for governor and among the Republicans for state treasurer and so on. But ours would be limited to you being able to vote in a primary without having to disclose your party affiliation.
Of course, we're all biased because we'd like to vote in a primary someday.
Well, and the argument is made that people are afraid to vote in primaries because then these records are public and the parties know who voted for them or who aligned themselves with them. And depending on if you have a public position or if you're a reporter, you maybe don't want that known. The parties argue that this is good because it makes people commit to a party. We know who our supporters are, and it stops people from coming in and trying to mess around with our primary and nominate the weaker candidates.
Well, and we'll have to leave it at that. I'd like to thank my guests for being on the show. Charlie, thank you for being here, and Pat, glad to have you.
Thank you.
I'm your host, Jamey Dunn, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.